question. We have an immediate paper now by Tamer. But in order to catch a little bit of breath, I suggest that we take a cup of tea and then we sit back. And in the meantime, you can ask your question more privately. Is that okay? So anyone who wants to grab a cup of coffee or tea, go ahead. And we'll be back. Thanks very much again for Jeroen and
yeah.
My question was actually, it seems to me for maybe for some more biomedical research, maybe it's a little bit easier to come up at a time with the criteria for inclusion. But for something like this, already seems like there's no idea how we do it. So I was wondering, how often did it happen that you were looking at papers during the selection process, and then you thought, well, actually, I think kind of like intuitively this is relevant, but it doesn't fit the inclusion criteria, so then you have to start.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's one reason why we chose the scoping review, because the scoping review and the other one is scoping review is semi-systematic, because it gives you this flexibility to engage in an iterative process. The better you know the picture, the more you can change. But you have to document all the changes. So at the outset, we had these are inclusion exclusion criteria, and then we screened them on 200 titles. And then we kind of reconvene and thought, okay, but this is an article that we think is relevant, what makes it relevant, and then we adjusted the we made a note, then and then we adjusted that. And then, but yeah, really good question. Very
that was, I was just thinking, like, it seems possible to just like get it right on the first go to go to the inclusion. Yeah, okay. It's still very interesting. I had some thoughts about this philosophy and how it's almost kind of weird how loosely things happen. Well, it's like Donald Davidson always said, and it's what we're interested in. So yeah, it's very interesting. Another question. Smaller project. Is this something that works?
No, I mean, the less the better. So I think we did do a really good job in planning the research. This is why we had so many publications. But I recommend to make it as narrow as possible. And ideally, you end up with, I don't know, maybe 500 titles and extras to screen, and then 20 or 30 papers to analyze. Yeah. Yeah, all the
All right, let's resume the session. If there are any people outdoors, we can so our next speaker is Tamer Nawar. He has just taken a position as a professor of philosophy at the University of Barcelona. Before that, he did a project in Groningen. Before that, he had a scholarship in Oxford. Before that, he received his and did his PhD at the University of Cambridge. So we invited him because he has a wonderful project on ancient philosophy, politically relevance, democracy, and also because we thought at a conference like this for students in research masters, that we think a serious study of the history of philosophy is of great importance. And he's a specialist in this area. So we're looking forward to your presentation. and take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the compliment. I hope your expectations are low, because that's the only way I can even manage to have fulfill them. So, can people hear me okay? So I should stand. Is that better? Okay. So I'll try. I move around a bit. So anyway, can I ask first? So just to get a sense of things a little bit, how many people, may I ask, work maybe primarily on, broadly speaking, ethical, political kind of issues in philosophy? Okay. Oh, that one. This oh, like karaoke. Okay. All right. So here we go. Right. So I was asking about people doing maybe ethical, political stuff. Maybe I can ask how many people do maybe more. I don't like these labels, but theoretical sort of stuff. Okay. And how many people do, again, awful label, history? History of stuff a little bit. Okay. So just, okay, that's helpful, get a little bit of a sense of things. So today I'll just be talking through kind of two papers that I've published in academic terms recently. The one you'll see is from 2018, but at least in my field, we would still call this recent, I guess. So the papers were sent around in advance, and I don't know if people have a chance to read them, but I'll basically try and talk you through the papers, and also try to give people a little bit of a sense of maybe at least how research in maybe my area, or at least the part of it that I'm familiar with, or the way I do things, works a little bit. So I guess maybe one thing, these two papers are quite different. So one of these is, it's called Democracy and Knowledge in Ancient Greece. And it's for a handbook edited, one of the editors is Jeroen, who gave us a very, I learned a lot from it about all the funding in the Netherlands, and I've been here for a few years. So yeah, anyway, but the point is, that one's a kind of more general paper, which, I'm not sure if the extent to which it counts as like breaking, well, I'm throwing all kinds of implicatures that I don't want to be thrown, but yeah, I'm not sure it's cutting edge research really is what I would want to say, but it does try to do something a little bit new and point maybe people in a direction that hasn't been maybe pursued to its fullest conclusion. And the other paper is very much just a traditional research paper that you would find in an academic journal. And in what I hope is not not mistaking the audience, I'll try and say a little bit about this stuff at the same time as actually talking about the research. So if I've misconstrued things and it's just completely obvious to you and this stuff is not useful, just give me, communicate it to me. You don't even need to say it out loud, but maybe from facial expression. So if you're expressive enough, I'll be able to tell that this is, I'll shut up about that stuff. But anyway, going on. So first I want to briefly talk about or talk you through the Democracy and Knowledge paper. And then I'll continue on with the others. So I'll be talking through these papers, but I think people do have them available to them if they've got relevant devices. And if not, if you don't have a device handy, then I think, it's at a fairly general level, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say. So hopefully it's easy enough to follow. So paper on democracy and knowledge in ancient Greece that tries to give an overview of how some ancient philosophers responded to classical democracy. So before I discuss maybe a little bit some things about how they did respond to classical democracy, it's worth saying one or two things about what classical democracy is. And classical democracy, as we're familiar with from places like Athens, is a little bit different from the kind of democratic systems of government that most of us are familiar with nowadays. So one way that an Athenian, a democracy like the Athenian is often characterized is that it's often characterized as direct or participatory or deliberative, as opposed to the kind of representative democracies that we are familiar with. So in our systems, very crudely speaking, if there's any political philosophers you can, or just people who actually know about politics, you can take me up on this and pull me apart later on. But broadly speaking, you know, in a representative democracy, we choose people who represent us and they kind of do the governing on our behalf. And we can elect them every now and then, and that's how things work. In a direct democracy, the thought is you are far more actually involved day to day in things. So basically, you know, there's differing opinions maybe on referenda and their value in recent years, but the idea is a lot more things would take place through that kind of mechanism, through things like referenda, where you put things, you don't just choose a government who will pursue a very broad, you know, kind of strategy. You actually put particular points of tactics to the public and citizenship, or citizenry rather, decide on these things together. So for instance, you might say, okay, this event has happened, how should we respond? You know, and that's something you're going to put to the public. So there's a lot of details about the Athenian democracy that I won't you know, dwell on just now, but because of the, you know, some points we have to speculate upon, but just because of the nature of the historical evidence, but we think that the citizenship was made up of maybe 30,000 or so adult males in Athens, and the population of Athens was much larger. So maybe, you know, over 200,000, but many of those people were, you know, women, many of those people were children, many of those people were slaves, and they would not have been full citizens. So among these citizens, there were very large, even though, you know, they were all quite similar in some respects, there were still very significant differences between them. Enormous differences of wealth, enormous differences of what we might regard as profession, and so on and so on. And there are all kinds of problems that you might have in engaging such a large body of people in the direct practice of governing. So the paper talks through some of the institutions, and I won't dwell on that just now. If you are super curious, just pull out your phone and like wiki it, and you can see, you know, the different institutions of Athens and how many people were legislators and how many people were serving in the courts and so on. The paper talks through that. Yeah. But there's some disagreement among historians about some of the details of Athenian democracy, but it's worth emphasizing at least 3 points. So first, voting. Voting was sometimes done by ballot. So think about, maybe you've taken part in some sort of democratic governance yourself, maybe at university, maybe at school, or something. You might have thought, okay, we need to decide things. How are we going to do it? Are people going to write down their decisions on a piece of paper? Or are we going to have a system whereby everyone sees what everyone else is deciding? And that's going to be more or less the system we pursue. So we actually don't know for sure about some of the details about how some things in Athens were done. But it does seem that sometimes voting was done by ballot, and sometimes it was done by show of hands. But it might not have been show of hands and you kind of count in a very conscientious way how many hands there are on each side. It might be more like, I asked you guys how many people were working on different things. I didn't actually count, I just sort of like got a sense. And to be honest, the numbers were really low on everything. So I don't know from any of you what your kind of primary focus is. But I could say, for instance, you know, there are actually far fewer people working on ethics than I expected. I would have expected, you know, usually it's like half or so, and it was much less than that. So sometimes you would go in a kind of impressionistic way of counting the votes on matters. Secondly, second important point to appreciate is that these among these institutions were the courts. And we often think of the courts as, you know, maybe very divorced from politics, or at least they should be. But in Athens, courts were fairly openly political institutions. So nowadays, I don't know this for sure, but I think this is an accurate impression. I think for many of us, if we see maybe in a particular governance or society that politicians are often on trial, often being prosecuted, often in prison, like you might think that the legal process is political in a kind of bad way. I mean, I don't know for sure. Well, what do you, I mean, since I have you guys here, what do you guys think? Would you think, yeah, that shows that something's going wrong with the courts? Or would you think, hey, that shows the courts are working really well because that means they go after people impartially? So, yeah, just any sense on that? So, just to be clear on what the question is, if you see politicians being prosecuted regularly in a society, would you take that to be a sign that the legal system is working well? Yes or no? So who's for yes? Who's for no? Okay. So just my curiosity. So I mean, there's all kinds of background assumptions that must be informing these decisions, and we won't go into that. But the point I want to emphasize is that in Athens, the popular courts were fairly openly political in a way, because one of the things they did very often was prosecute politicians. That you could expect that to be your lot if you went into a very active or a big role in politics in Athens. You would probably get prosecuted at some point. That was, that would be the pessimistic or optimistic induction you might make based on the past cases. One way of viewing this positively is that the courts act as a kind of system of checks and balances on the politicians. So they go too far, the courts kind of pull them back, or maybe only retrospectively. So anyway, third point I want to emphasize about this system. So this is all just history, and we can debate the details and so on. But there's philosophy of sorts to follow. So the third point is that even though there's enormous difference there were enormous differences among the Athenians in terms of the amount of wealth that people would have and so on. There does seem to have been there was a lot of rotation among kind of offices that people would fulfill or act in within the democracy. But there does seem to have been something like a political class in some sense, in that some people had a lot of money, and some people, among those people with money, were drawn towards a fairly active political life and would pursue things like a rhetorical education. So again, I don't know how familiar you are with maybe the UK system, but you can think of the sort of person who might go to Oxford and study PPE, and you can see how wonderfully that's worked out for the UK over the last 30 or so years, because so many people in the leading political parties have gone through that system. So if you want some kind of terrible modern analogy, it's a very loose one. Maybe that's one to think about. So people maybe with a certain amount of money could pursue politics or an active role in politics, being a star in politics, by doing things like, pursuing a rhetorical education, learning how to persuade people, and so on and so on. Now, it's been argued by some scholars, some scholars of political science, some philosophers, most notably Josiah Ober, who cuts across most of these categories, that Athens was a remarkably successful state while it was a democracy. And that was partly due to its democratic institutions and the way they promoted rational deliberation, the way they successfully aggregated and employed the knowledge of the citizens. So we might have groups like ourselves, maybe fairly diverse in some respects. So maybe some people know about certain things, some people know about other things. Democracy, the thought is, or democratic institutions like the Athenian ones, allowed such groups to effectively pool their knowledge. So we could just, thought is we would pool our opinions, but the knowledge would somehow rise to the top and we would act on it. So there's a lot of details, finer details, historical details, and sociological details about how this is meant to happen that I won't go into. But the thought is, you know, if you've got the citizens involved in this way, then you're going to have more realistic, more sustainable policies. So for instance, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, you have this kind of completely unrealistic policy proposal. People are going to respond and tell you that's not realistic for these reasons. You want to get all these, you think farming this way will produce this amount of crops. It won't, I'm a farmer. And you know, farmers, the knowledge of the farmers might come through. That's the thought, roughly speaking. Ober's account of classical democracy has been enormously influential. It's influential in political philosophy nowadays. It's influential in political science. And, you know, there are many reasons why that might be. So it might just be it's really good. But, you know, in some ways, it's kind of like nice and flattering, right? It's like democracy, you know, works pretty well. Maybe it could work even better if we just make it a little bit more classical, a little bit more participatory, and so on. So there's a couple of worries you might raise about this kind of picturing. In the paper, I discuss some of them. But I think one of the most salient worries, and this is maybe the best one for understanding where people like Plato are coming from, is that even if you think that democratic institutions effectively aggregate preferences and opinions, there's maybe fairly little reason to think that they aggregate knowledge or anything that's actually truth directed in the appropriate way. And I think that in a way, that's maybe one of the central worries that Plato has about democracy. I mean, he has many, and I'll discuss some of them in a moment. But that's one of the, I think, one of the central ones, and maybe one of the more persuasive and one of the more plausible. So before going on to discuss Plato and Plato's views about democracy in any detail, I should just note, we have lots of discussions of democracy from the ancient world, but almost all of them are by critics of democracy. You won't find many friends of democracy among the extant sources. Why is that? I mean, there could be all sorts of reasons. You could speculate sociologically. A lot of these people like Plato, they come from fairly, you know, well-to-do, let's say, backgrounds, might have, let's say, sociological reasons for preferring something like a, you know, not a rule of, you know, all the citizens, but just some of them who maybe know better than others, and so on. But criticisms of democracy are fairly widespread among our ancient Greco-Roman and especially our ancient Greek writers. There are some qualified defenses of them, most notably in one anonymous text. I won't discuss that now. Maybe it'll come up later on. But maybe one of the most famous and one of the most interesting critics of democracy is Plato. And I think many people will be familiar with many aspects of Plato's criticism of democracy. But in this particular paper, I tried to kind of frame his criticisms in terms of so-called political epistemology, which is this slightly new and kind of burgeoning field which looks at epistemology in a fairly social way, as opposed to an individualistic way. And not merely in a social way, but in a political way. So the thought is we don't just think about how to reason well individually or how the individual should reason well. And we don't just even think about how people should reason well together with others in a kind of social setting, maybe collaboratively or within a kind of social group, but rather explicitly politically. That's the thought. And you know, where you draw the dividing line between so-called social epistemology and political epistemology, who knows? You know, that's we're not going to go into that. But I was trying to frame some traditional points of discussion and some new points of discussion with regards to that. So the thought is maybe some of these points, some of which are old, some of which maybe arguably are new, they might be interesting to people thinking about so-called political epistemology. That's where this paper is coming from. And I think the central point maybe to emphasize with regards to Plato's criticism of democracy, especially of the epistemic features of democracy, is the following. So anyone who's read the Republic will know that in Plato's, ideal or idealized Callipolis, there's very few elements which we would regard as democratic or which Plato himself would have regarded as democratic. And there's many familiar points of criticism. So one familiar point of criticism is that democracy unjustly treats unequals as if they were equals. So you might find Plato's Socrates saying this sort of thing, like everyone, everyone's opinion is worth the same, the child as much as the wise old person and so on. And I mean, I think for a modern reader, maybe who's slightly pro-democratic, a lot of this stuff won't sit that well. You may not be that sympathetic to it. But I think there's maybe one point which is, or maybe arguably a little bit more interesting. And what I tried to frame as what I took to be one of Plato's central arguments against democracy is more or less as follows. So it's a very simple argument, and it's composed of three steps. So the first premise is that if something lacks knowledge of the relevant kind, then that thing can't rule well. And the thought behind that premise is that you need a certain kind of knowledge. It's a necessary condition of ruling well, of doing things well when it comes to ruling, when it comes to governing, and so on. That's the first premise. The second premise is very straightforward. The demos, the populace of the citizenry, they lack the relevant knowledge, so they can't rule well. And if they can't rule well, then they shouldn't rule, and that means no democracy, no demos in charge, no classical democracy. So let's try and break down that argument a little bit and see exactly where Plato's coming from. So the first premise, it's basically claiming that a certain kind of knowledge is a necessary condition of successful rule. And Plato evidently sets the bar really high on what this kind of knowledge would look like. So if you've read the Republic, you might be familiar with the extremely difficult and long period of training you have to go through in order to be a philosopher ruler at the end. And if you read Plato's other dialogues, you might have read, for instance, maybe in Theaetetus or maybe in other dialogues, it's very often inquiries into the nature of episteme, Greek term which we often render as knowledge today. And this seems to be an elevated cognitive state. It requires more than mere true belief, and it seems to be really difficult to get. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions built into what this state is, but for instance, here are some. If you got this thing, if you know, you can teach. If you know, you can pass it on. And so for instance, you might look at someone successful. Let's say, okay, Djokovic, he's a good tennis player. Does he possess like the proper knowledge of tennis playing? We might wonder. Well, Plato's Socrates thinks, well, if he knows, he should be able to pass it on. So let's look at his students. Can they play well? And I mean, I don't know enough about Djokovic. I don't think he teaches anyone. But the thought is, at least in the Athenian context, if you look at a lot of the people who are meant to be political experts, they didn't seem to be able to pass on their knowledge very well. So I don't know who would be an uncontroversial or at least minimally controversial example of a great politician today. Anyone want to volunteer one? You can get slaughtered or you might not. I can't say how others will react. Someone you think, you might not agree with them, but you think this was, person was good at governance. Obama, okay. We'll take Obama as an example. So thought is, okay, all these people, they're saying Obama's so great. Obama's so great. Well, let's look at his proteges and see how they've done. If he's so great, he must have this kind of knowledge in virtue of which he does things well, unless he just did things through luck. And if he had the knowledge, then he should be able to pass it on. So let's see if he did it. Now, Obama, I don't think I've kept up with American politics well enough, but I can't think of any Obama proteges. I mean, Trump has proteges of a sort, but we maybe don't want to dwell on that for various reasons. But the thought would be, at least in the Athenian context, the people who are meant to be great, people like Pericles, they didn't seem to be able to pass on whatever it was they had. So whatever it was they had couldn't have been this genuine form of knowledge. The assumption being it's genuine form of knowledge. It's something that you can pass on. Now, there's a lot of other assumptions about this kind of knowledge as well. If you've got it, you should be able to withstand interrogation or examination. So think about an expert you drag into a courtroom and you put questions to the expert, but then they start suddenly contradicting themselves. That person would fail the test. And in many of the Platonic dialogues, you find Socrates putting questions to people and they seem to be meant to be experts, but they fail, quickly start contradicting themselves when being pressed with these questions. So the thought is you need this elevated form of knowledge in order to rule well, but it's very hard to get. Now, could it be that the demos has it? So I won't talk too much about Aristotle today, but there is an argument in Aristotle, and you could maybe find roots of it in some earlier thinkers, which is maybe not one person has it individually, but if you pull things together, maybe the citizenship as a whole has this thing. So the thought would be, maybe I'll just read this passage. Actually, it's from Aristotle's Politics. So this is Aristotle's Politics. He says, the view that the majority, rather than those who are the best people, albeit few, should be in control, would seem to be well stated and to involve some puzzles, though perhaps also some truth. For the many, each of whom individually is not an excellent man, nevertheless may, when they have come together, be better than the few best people, not individually, but collectively, just as dinners to which many people contribute are better than dinners provided at one person's expense. There's an enormous amount of discussion about how to understand this. So some people take this to be a kind of articulation of a proto-democratic kind of theory, thought being maybe, if we get a potluck together, everyone brings a dish, we're going to have a great dinner, maybe. That's going to be better than the kind of dinner that one person on their own could provide, even if they are maybe a good cook and able to, they've got the resources to cook a lot of stuff. So one way of trying to resist Plato's views is to say, well, this, even if we grant you this view, which, many people won't grant, but that you need this really high bar knowledge in order to rule well, maybe the demos collectively has this kind of knowledge, even if individuals don't have it. Now, you can find perhaps hints of this view in some earlier thinkers, but Plato would resist it. He would disagree. And the thought is, crudely speaking, Plato just sees that there's a lot of impediments and obstacles within a kind of democratic context to actually obtaining knowledge or to even possessing knowledge collectively, as it were. So some of these are institutional barriers or obstacles. So crudely speaking, Plato thinks that the democratic institutions of Athens, they don't really allow us to exchange reasons in the proper way. So it would be a bit like, you know, you want to have a really proper discussion about this difficult issue, but there's only 3 minutes to do it, and you can only ask 2 questions. What would be the point of that? Now, I've done a caricature ever so slightly, but a lot of Athenian institutions were a little bit more towards that end. So a trial would have to be settled fairly quickly. It's not something that would go on usually for weeks or for days. It would go on for hours. You know, prosecution gives a speech, defense gives a speech, right, execute Socrates and move on. That's the, you know, I'm obviously being crude and so on. But that's, you know, that's lying in the background of the Platonic worries sometimes. There are these institutional difficulties. And that's something he discusses in a number of dialogues. So for instance, in the Theaetetus, which is a dialogue which inquires into the nature of knowledge, there's this discussion about why the jurors, maybe they can have true belief, but they can't have episteme. And it seems one of those reasons is just they don't have enough time to really get into the nitty-gritty and properly understand things. Now, another thing that's maybe slightly interesting is that there aren't just these democratic barriers due to the nature of, you know, democratic institutions in classical Athens, because, you know, you could resolve those other issues by maybe giving people more time or what have you. But Plato seems to think that there's something actually fairly epistemically malignant about putting people together in the way that classical classical democratic institutions like Athenian ones do. And a lot of these difficulties basically arise from the nature of rhetoric and the fact that people are, he thinks, very often more attracted to pleasure than to truth. And you could basically, I mean, if you are an anti-populist of some kind or other, you might sympathize with Plato on that note, even if you disagree with him about many other things, including his anti-democratic arguments. So the thought is, you know, it's very easy to be misled by wishful thinking. It's very easy to just take the easy but not necessarily true answer to some question. And a lot of people are prone to doing that. So if you're familiar with the, with maybe, for instance, the Gorgias, there's a famous image there about how a public orator, a public speaker is a bit like a pastry chef. He feeds his clients, you know, these tasty things that they want to eat, but aren't actually very good for them. And, you know, if you're familiar with populistic politics from the last few years, you could agree or disagree in virtue of the evidence you have available to you on some of those issues. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about this, and I could go on for much longer. I've just given you a very general overview of some of the points I was trying to make in that paper with regards to Plato. I'm going to pause here and ask any questions at this point.
Or perhaps a little question. So Plato's thought was, if you know something, then you can teach it. And if the person's taught don't pick it up, then the teacher wasn't really in the know. Should we think here of propositional knowledge, or is it know-how? So, and there's a whole discussion whether the one can be reduced to the other. What's going on here, you think?
So it's a great question. The question is, you know, if we've got this kind of this notion that being able to teach is a necessary condition on having the relevant kind of knowledge, what is this thing? Is it propositional knowledge, such as our knowledge that, you know, Paris is the capital of France or something like that? Or is it maybe a bit more like know-how, like you might be able to know how to play the piano or something like that? And as Renee was pointing out, sometimes people, I mean, it's a fairly common view among many philosophers that know-how is maybe not reducible to knowledge that, although people do disagree on this. But the thought is, You can't boil down the knowledge of how to ride a bike to just knowing this series of propositions. That's what some people think. So the question is, how is this epistemic state being conceived? Is it this? Is it that? Is it something else? It's a difficult question. It's very controversial. I think maybe one way of trying to answer it that seems, I don't think it really answers the question in a way, but to start is, episteme, sometimes people like to render it as more something like understanding than as maybe just knowledge straightforwardly. Now that just raises the old questions, which is like, okay, if it's understanding, does that mean that that is reducible to knowledge that, or to some propositional mental attitudes? There's all kinds of questions you could raise about this. So like some people think that understanding is not active in quite the same way that knowledge is, and so on, and so on, and so on. I have my own account of episteme and how it works. I'm happy to talk about it later. I think it would, it would just derail things a little bit. But I think at least it probably can't be ordinary propositional knowledge as we usually conceive of it, unless you build in a lot of extra stuff into it. So maybe if you boost that enough, you might have a reasonable account of episteme. But yeah, a lot of it's, a lot of the things that Plato says about it seem to push it beyond what we would speak of as ordinary propositional knowledge. So for instance, it seems to have to be systematic in a certain way that, knowledge can be piecemeal, but it can be systematic. It has to be systematic. The list goes on, but that would be a first stab at answer of sorts. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, good question. At the start of the presentation, you mentioned reports that operated as political bodies. I was wondering, what did they prosecute people for? Was it like breaking the law, being unpopular? Was it like a method of recalling politicians?
So all sorts of things, but yeah, unpopularity could be it. So you can be ostracized basically, and there's. I'm trying to think of modern analogies. I'm struggling. Maybe someone can help me out with one. But yeah, maybe something you do just does not go well. So it could be anything. It may not, it could be, for instance, you have a military role. You're in charge of this expedition, but it goes terribly wrong. Basically you could be exiled for a period of 10 years or so.
And those were decided on the basis of votes as well.
Typically, yes. So yeah, that would be the short answer. There's some complications and so on, but yeah. Yes.
I suppose maybe the modern analogy is the cancel culture.
So you could draw analogies with cancel culture, maybe. So I don't know enough about this myself. I don't really know what cancel culture is. I've certainly heard the term, but I couldn't say what it is. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that sometimes people say they've been canceled when just people don't like what they say or who they are and stuff. But this is a little bit different, so at least in this context. So this is more like you can no longer step foot in the city, and if you do, you would be executed. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of this, this thing denoted by the term cancel culture nowadays. So I would.
It's very big.
Yeah, I'm not qualified, above my pay grade, and to be honest, who knows what I might say something inappropriate or wrong myself. I don't know, but yeah. Any other questions at this point?
A question about I said Obama and used to give his knowledge to the next generation. But about you could say he wrote a book about his years, and you could also argue that in politics it's more to do with you can't choose, like you didn't choose Biden or Trump to like really how do you say that, to follow him up. So it's really difficult, I think, also for Obama to share his knowledge with these people if they don't want to hear it. So I really
So great, yeah. So, you know, what if you can teach, but there's like no one around to, you know, no one who wants to learn from you or something. So, you know, I'm sure some academics might sympathize or something with this sort of worry. But I think, yeah, the Platonic point is you need to be able to do it. And if you're not able, that's what's, you know, that's what's crucial. So you might be a great pianist and you might be able to teach pianists and teach them to become really great, but maybe there's no one around to teach. But you could still be able to do that even in the absence of any willing students or so on. But the point that Plato draws is these people have tried and they failed. That's why we know that they're not able. So, you know, if they were able, you know, and given that they tried, they should have succeeded. That's the thought. So it will be more like if Obama took Buttigieg under his wing and, you know, every day he's like, you know, Buttigieg, you need to do this. And Buttigieg just, you know, he can't do it. And not only that, like no one else can do it either. So I don't know who else would be on the Democratic wing, but just, you know, it's not just the deficiency in this one pupil. Like he can't, yeah, he can't pass it on. That's the worry, and that's why there's this suspicion that these people don't have the relevant kind of knowledge. Now, of course, a very reasonable response, and I think very one that many modern people would have, is just like Plato. You are, you know, and maybe we're not surprised, but you know, you've got your head in the clouds, and this is, you know, this is absurd. You've just set the bar way too high on what this knowledge is. Set it, be a bit more realistic, and you know, maybe then we can allow that some people actually have this knowledge, because otherwise you're looking for something, but you've set the bar so high that no one's got it. That would be, you know, one fairly common, I think, modern intuition or response.
Would you say that they be a sort of technocrat nowadays, in the sense that if okay, maybe it doesn't align well with theory knowledge, but if, let's say, in the example of the pianist, we have like an AI system that the pianist plays well according to these subjective values, static values, whatever, and then there's this system that can detect the pressure of the fingers on the keys and the fastness and everything, and the tunes of the instrument. And then another person can sit in there, and another machine reported by that system can play in the same exact moments, and none of the two know how to do it, but in effect, it's happening. So that, yeah, maybe it's too bold to say that the machine possesses the knowledge in Plato's account, but if effectively society could distribute to those machines, maybe Plato would be happy with that.
So thanks very much. So there's a lot there. So let me break it down a little bit. So technocracy, yes, absolutely. Like he's your man in a way. Like you know, maybe the Draghi government or something would come closest to, you know, Plato's dream in modern Europe or something. It's like, okay, this guy maybe supposedly, or someone thinks he knows what he's doing. AI, machines, and so on. It's a little tricky. So, I mean, for obvious reasons, it's not something that appears very explicitly in Plato's dialogues. But the I think the thought would be, you know, in these kinds of cases, I think Plato would think this is basically some kind of fancy tool. It would be a bit like we've got some other sort of, just think of something that's really quite obviously dumb, but actually produces great effects. So in that case, you might marvel at the intelligence of the designer and so on. And I think that that's more or less the route that Plato would go down. So It might be that the person who's designed the system has got all kinds of wonderful things going on in them. And it might be that somehow this AI does stuff. So maybe the AI, I don't know. So, I don't know, anyone here play the piano? Little? Anyone familiar with Steinway pianos? Famously, you know, beautiful sounding, your standard concert piano, sounds wonderful, dreadfully expensive. Well, they've got one called I think it's called the Spirio. It's got a player piano system built into it. And basically kind of, you know, you don't need to physically touch the keys. It can play itself. And it's got recordings of the great pianists of the past. So you want to hear Duke Ellington play? I don't know how they did it, but somehow they simulated his, you know, his actual, it's not just the playback. It's not like they recorded Duke Ellington playing and then it just plays back the sound. No, it simulates his actual playing, his pressing of the keys, and it plays that back to you. Wonderful, and so on. But it wouldn't be the machine like teaching. Like maybe you could watch this and somehow learn how to play. It wouldn't be the machine teaching you. At least I think on Plato's view, it would instead be somehow Duke Ellington, even though he's dead, and so on. Or maybe the person who designed the piano and so on. So obviously this, you know, just to be really clear, this is like a Platonic take of sorts and, you know, just one interpretation. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Any other, oh yeah.
A question about Aristotle.
Yes.
About standard justification for democracy. So in the paper you mentioned that there's different interpretations of that quote. Could you guys, do you think, roughly speaking, Aristotle was maybe able to support the more like I think there's more modern arguments for the justification of democracy based on self-standing benefits, like democracy and system.
Yeah.
Do you think he tried to remind that or?
So the short answer is, in my view, no. I don't think so. So I guess the like he doesn't discuss it. Like that's one of the very few things he says. If you were looking for you know, if you were looking for something substantive, you wouldn't find it. But I also think he just wouldn't be on your side in general. So it wouldn't be something he would hope to provide. That passage can indeed be interpreted in a number of ways. Some people take it to be saying more or less the same thing as a Condorcet jury theorem. So the thought is roughly, hey, we got all those people in the room, you know, instead of putting things to a judge, expert as they might be, we put it to a jury. Why? Because the thought is if people are even, you know, if they're going to get things right, even just microscopically over half the time, then if we aggregate enough people, and crucially, those people are independent, then, you know, we're going to increase the chance of us getting things right just because of Condorcet jury theorem. Now, Plato and Aristotle don't discuss that, again, for obvious reasons, but they would deny the independent claim. They would deny that, you know, they would say that that's an idealization. It doesn't obtain. Instead, what happens is you've got people maybe reasoning, maybe pseudo-independently, but the bad and terrible beliefs infect the others like a terrible miasma in all kinds of different ways. And yeah, I think that's why they'd be fairly pessimistic about that kind of thing. But that would be the short answer. But there's a lot more, and I could be completely wrong. It's just, yeah, it's an interpreter's question. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So maybe I'll say a little bit more then about the other paper. Even though it's much longer, I'll be much briefer about it. So I was trying to just frame this a little bit as a kind of project, you know, in making a contribution towards political epistemology of this earlier paper. And I didn't really say what it could contribute to political epistemology, but maybe I'll mention that now very briefly. So I think maybe one thing that it could contribute is the ancients were very alive and sensitive to the powers of rhetoric in a way that I think that many philosophers have not been until, except fairly sporadically. And, Aristotle's writing on rhetoric and how rhetoric can, I don't want to say manipulate, but maybe influence emotions, is in my view, a remarkably incisive and insightful kind of discussion into those issues. And I think maybe, those interested in political epistemology might look to that if they wanted to have insight. But that is maybe more a kind of warning of the dangers of populism and so on than how to do things right kind of perspective. So I want to briefly say something about the other paper then, just very, very briefly. So, and I'll maybe try and describe a little bit like where it comes from and stuff. So the other paper is called Thrasymachus Unerring Skill and the Arguments of Republic I. And it's about the first book of Plato's Republic. So the Republic, it's a text that has been fairly central, not as central as we nowadays take it to be, but fairly central for a very long period of time. And people have been discussing it for a long period of time. And you might think, well, it's hard to say anything new about such a text, and that might be true. So you might wonder, well, how do you write a paper on Plato? So I think, you could do it in many different ways, just autobiographically in this particular case. There might be something that you perceive a particular difficulty when reading the text. You think, well, I don't understand this argument doesn't make sense to me. And then you look for some guidance in the literature, and maybe you don't find it, or you just disagree with what you find, and that kind of spurs you towards thinking, well, this can't be right, what's going on here? And then you try and figure it out. And maybe in the course of doing so, well, that's writing a paper. Like that would be the way that you figure it out. That can be one way of figuring a thing out. And I think it's not too unusual for historians of philosophy. So you might read something, find a problem or an argument or something that you don't quite understand, or that doesn't quite make sense, or it seems a bit strange, and you just try and understand this, and that's kind of how that rough germ can develop into a paper. In this paper, I really focus on the arguments of the first book of the Republic, in that one of the main issues in that paper comes back to something I've already discussed. We already discussed the notion that if you know something, you are able to teach it. And a lot of this paper is concerned with what it takes to be able to do something, and so on. But just very crudely speaking, to give a very crude overview of some of the main issues in the paper, in the first book of the Republic, you very famously find Thrasymachus, this kind of arch immoralist, sometimes he's regarded as, claiming that justice is the interest of the stronger. And the Platonic project in the Republic, at least in part, seems to be to give a response of some kind to that question. So say what justice is, and maybe say what role it plays or how it's beneficial or something along those lines. Now, first book of the Republic, in the view of many scholars, is full of fairly bad arguments. So when Thrasymachus puts forward this view, Socrates tries to trip him up, and Socrates says, well, if you think that, well, it seems these undesirable consequences follow, and then they have a to and fro about it. And many commentators think that these arguments are fairly terrible by and large. And I guess the main sort of big picture of the paper is maybe they're not quite so bad. Would be the main thesis I was arguing for in this paper. So without going into all of the paper, because it is quite long and there is quite a lot of detail, I thought I might just give an overview of some of the, maybe some of the issues very crudely. So just to recap things very, 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 very succinctly, Thrasymachus has this view that justice is the interest of whoever is most powerful, let's say, or whoever's in charge. And that's a view you might find, nowadays, maybe even in a philosophy seminar. And he says basically that there's all kinds of questions about the details of Thrasymachus' view. But he seems to be saying, or at least Socrates gets them to accept that he's saying, that within a particular state, an action is just if and only if it's advantageous to the people who are ruling that state. So the thought is, think maybe about what's legal or what's not legal in a particular state. And the thought might be, we should all be able to download movies or whatever, but it's not legal. Why is it not legal? The heads of the movie companies, they're the guys in charge. They're the ones setting all the rules and stuff. I'm caricaturing. This is terribly crude, but I think you see where this is coming from. So that's the first claim that he seems to subscribe to. The second claim is that if an action is or involves obeying the ruler, well, then it's a just action. So the first claim is an action is just if and only if it's advantageous to the rulers. Second claim is that if the ruler tells you to do something, then whatever they tell you to do, that's just. And third claim is that sometimes rulers make mistakes. And the problem with that is that we've now got a contradiction on our hands, because if they can make mistakes, then suppose that they do make a mistake when they set the rules, they try to tell you something, to do something that they think is advantageous to themselves, but in fact is not. That action will both be just and, will maybe not be just, and so on. Now, Thrasymachus sees the problem, and he says something that has puzzled a lot of people. He says rulers can't make mistakes. That's his response to the Socratic reductio of his position. And here's Julia Annis, a great scholar of ancient philosophy and an influential moral philosopher. She says this is a very counterintuitive position, and Thrasymachus is only forced into saying this about skills in general because he finds it plausible as a position to hold about the stronger in any situation. He is thinking of the obviously true point that the man who has the upper hand cannot afford to make mistakes, or he will soon cease to have the upper hand. He saves the consistency of his position by a verbal move that makes this true of all rulers and all practitioners of any skill. But this flouts our beliefs about doctors, rulers, etc. And many other people would more or less agree. There's different details on how bad people think that this view is and why it's bad. So some people think it's more or less, it's bad for a slightly different reason. It's bad for a kind of no true Scotsman sort of reason. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it might be like, I make a claim to you. I say, any Madrileño supports, Real Madrid. You go, well, wait a second, my cousin's from Madrid and he supports Atletico. Okay, any true Madrileño supports Real Madrid. That some people think that Thrasymachus is doing more or less that. Now, there's a lot of details about how to understand what's going on in the first book of the Republic, but I want to argue basically, and what I argue in this paper is that actually Thrasymachus' view is not as crazy as you might think it is on the surface. And it's actually based on a fairly, I don't want to say widely held, but at least a well thought out position within Greek thought at the time. The paper talks you through some of the context. So basically there's a branch of sophistic and Hippocratic thought which thinks of a skill or an expertise as a kind of perfected practical rationality or area of rationality. So for instance, this is crude and doesn't get things quite right, but just think about the oddities of saying something like there are mistakes in mathematics. You might think, well, that seems a bit weird. Now, can mathematicians make mistakes? Sure. But insofar as they do make mistakes, they are not being mathematicians, would be the thought. And you might think, well, that's just the true Scotsman thing that you said before. In the paper, I try to argue that it's not, and I mean, that's kind of elaborate, and I won't take you through all the details. But there's interesting things, at least I think that they're interesting, that you might glean about the nature of ability and what it takes to be able to do something by working through some of the arguments in the Republic. And the thought is, at least what's driving a lot of this sort of stuff, I argue, in Thrasymachus's position, is the thought that if you've got the ability to do something, then if you were to try to do it, then you would do it basically successfully. That's the thought. So if you, for instance, let's say you're able to play, I don't know, Beethoven's 21st Sonata on the piano. So there's, well, if you're able to do it and you were to try to do it, then you would actually do it. If you try to do it and all that comes out is a terrible, mess of noise, then you weren't able to do it. Maybe you can do it every now and then, as it were, by fluke, but you don't have a kind of robust ability to do it. There's a lot more to be said about this, and I won't talk you through all of it. But basically, the thought is that once you properly understand Thrasymachus's position, then you can get a much better understanding of how Socrates in the dialogue is responding to that position. So the thought is, if we understand the position he's responding to, we can much better understand his response. And then the paper kind of talks you through some ways in which that works out. So many people have thought that Thrasymachus's position was very silly, but they've also thought that Socrates' arguments against that position were very silly. And in the paper, I kind of try to argue that no, they're not. Now, there's a lot more to say about this, and in the interest of time, I'll just maybe pause there. And yeah, I think hopefully it's okay timing-wise.
Right, we have 6 more minutes to go.
Okay, so I'll pause here for if there's any questions at this point. Just a very general kind of overview of this second paper. I don't know if people have any questions about this or about anything else. Thank you very much.
I might have like a more methodological question with
Sure.
the second paper. Because you reply to, well, an interpretation by others who think, well, this argument from Thrasymachus, I don't know how to pronounce it, is silly, or like for me, I'm always very curious, like how does such an argument between different authors and different interpretations of a text that is like, it goes back quite some time, how do you resolve that? Like, how do you know that your interpretation here is the right one, and how does something like that, does it get resolved, or someone will, of course, then reply to you and say like, no, this argument is silly. What's your experience in that?
So great question. I'm not a great person to ask about methodology. I'm not that reflective on this sort of issue as maybe I should be, but yeah, so I think in philosophy in general, it's pretty hard to like settle, a thing so that, everyone's satisfied. I don't want to say it's never happened, but it's pretty hard to think of any occasions where it has. So yeah, how do you how do you weigh this sort of contribution, or like, how do you evaluate it? I mean, there's all kinds of different ways of doing this. So I think, in philosophy, it's we are a very heterogeneous kind of field. Lots of people approaching it from many different perspectives. For some people, it might be more about self-expression in a way. Like, this is I don't know how to say this in a nice way. It's not quite my perspective, but like, this is my truth or something. And, that might be the end of it. In a slightly more boring way, and maybe you can see where I'm coming from, you might think, okay, well, there's these, if you were trying to maybe if you have some empirical data about, behavior of something, you might try and come up with a theory that explains or correctly predicts or accounts for the data you have, and maybe can even predict some other data. And I think that would be something like the approach I favor here. So does it make sense of things that would otherwise be puzzling or just cannot be explained and so on? So for instance, maybe a traditional view or a view I disagree with cannot explain A, B, C, and D, and mine can. But maybe mine can't explain E and F. And then it's up to people to decide whether they think that E and F is to be given more weight than A, B, C, and D, and so on. So each person will, decide for themselves, clearly. And it may be that there's not going to be anything that satisfies everyone. And that, I think, is often going to be the case in philosophy. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that's often the case maybe when doing history of philosophy, but also when just doing philosophy more generally. So you might be doing philosophy of language or even something else. And, there's maybe reasons to be drawn towards different positions. And you might just be wondering, well, I can do a good job of this and I can explain away at least some of these reasons. Maybe not all, but some. And that's the best I can do. And, take it or leave it, basically. But yeah, I don't know if that helps or if that's of any useful.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if this first premise of that argument, an act is just if it is advantageous to the ruler, is this supposed to be more a descriptive statement, or so we just figure out in our environments that acts that are called just are those acts that are in fact advantageous to the ruler? Is that the idea, or is it that is it actually a premise that derives a norm from a fact?
So it's a great question. So the maybe just one tiny point. So the way I had the first premise was actually as a biconditional between them, but if the question still stands. So there's disagreement basically about how to understand it. So some people do go in exactly the way that you were suggesting. Some people prefer something like an action is called, open quotation marks, just, if and only if, blah, blah, blah. It serves the interests and so on. And yeah, there's a lot of disagreement about how to understand Thrasymachus's views more generally. So is he just offering an observation on how the term just is being used? Is he offering something more like a genealogical explanation of, where this notion comes from and, critiquing it and so on at the same time? Is he actually just saying like, this should be the way, this should be the way that things are done? So it's pretty up for grabs. I have more sympathy with the first two kind of views I was describing, and not necessarily with the last one. But I think to be honest, it's very difficult to distinguish between these as far as Thrasymachus is concerned. And I was just trying to actually get, there are lots of details of Thrasymachus's position that I don't go into in the paper. And to be honest, I'm not actually decided on myself. But I do think he would subscribe to that claim at least. So he seems to subscribe to it. One possible response is that there's something that's gone on here that's a little bit funny, and he's been kind of tricked maybe by Socrates. And I don't know, maybe Socrates pulled the fast one on him because maybe Thrasymachus was just talking about how the term just is used. And, maybe Socrates got him talking about what's just. But maybe if you allow for some simple disquotation and some other stuff, maybe this is okay. I mean, it's a minefield basically. So I don't have a short answer. A non-answer. All right. Well, thank you for your thanks for your patience, and I hope that was
well. I think this was a very nice presentation, and the quiet way of presenting these thoughts was, I think, really